what even is COP30? Short for Conference of the Parties, it's how the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change gets all of the world's governments, the parties, into one place every year since 1995. Once gathered, the parties negotiate how they're going to tackle climate change, which in COPs gone by has resulted in some important agreements. It's the 30th COP this year, so what can we expect to come out of Belém? Now, if you're feeling a sense of déjà vu, that's because this video is partly made of re-edited footage from some YouTube shorts that we made recently. Because COP's kind of a big deal, and we want to make sure as many people know about this as possible. But as well as the footage from those shorts, there's a bunch of new material in this video, so even if you watch the shorts, please do keep watching. Anyway, back to Belém.
Common but differentiated responsibility is a phrase you'll hear a lot relating to COP30. It was laid out at COP3 as part of the Kyoto Protocol, and recognises that while everyone is working towards the common goal of stopping climate change, that different countries have different roles to play. Kyoto bound high emitters to making cuts, but also recognised that they may need to pass on resources to developing countries to keep emissions low.
How low? Well, enough to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees, which isn't gonna happen. That target was agreed in 2015 under the Paris Agreement, a product of COP21. Countries also agreed to better record keeping and to the creation of a series of 5-year plans called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, a third of which were due this year, but not everyone has produced them, so expect to hear some fuss about that. Now, in the 10 years since Paris, COPs have been, less groundbreaking. It hasn't helped that the last two have been held in petro-states, the United Arab Emirates and Azerbaijan, allowing fossil fuel lobbyists to get a bit too involved. Last year, despite a recommendation that the world should provide $1.3 trillion of climate finance per year, lobbying watered down the new collective quantified goal agreed at COP29 to only $300 billion a year. A trillion short. That will be revisited this year to, in theory, make a roadmap to 1.3 trillion by 2035.
To do so, negotiators must overcome fossil fuel lobbyists, late NDCs, an obstructive US administration, and more.
Now, many people have referred to COP30 as the implementation COP, and what they mean by that is we're probably not going to see a bunch of big new announcements or huge new targets being made at COP30. Instead, we're going to see the nuts and bolts of specific previous announcements being worked out, or at least that's the hope. And because the United States isn't sending any high-level officials, though there's over 100 state and local leaders attending, that's hopefully removed one of the more obstructive elements to previous negotiations, and so maybe we'll actually see a bunch of progress being made on the nuts and bolts. But of course, the United States wasn't the only obstructive element in the room. Did you know that at COP26, only 56% of attendees represented a country? 10% were media, and the remainder were observers, many of whom work for the fossil fuel industry. Last year at COP29 in Baku, at least 1,773 delegates were fossil fuel lobbyists, which eclipsed the number of passes given to the 10 most climate vulnerable countries combined. In fact, at COP29, for every 10 fossil fuel lobbyists, there was just one representative from indigenous populations who are disproportionately affected by climate change.
These lobbyists work for corporations that profit from pollution. They say they want to be part of the solution, but their track record has shown them using their presence to delay climate action and undermine efforts to fix the problem at its root cause, transitioning away from fossil fuels.
Somebody literally wrote a play about this. I went. It's very good. We won't have the full data for COP30 this year until the conference begins, but in previous years, the number of fossil fuel lobbyists has been trending up. Since the 2015 Paris Agreement, lobbyists have just swarmed climate talks, peaking at COP28 over in Dubai, with at least 2,456 making up 3% of all attendees. That's why a global movement known as Kick Big Polluters Out has demanded change. And this year, there has been a big step forward, because at COP30, they've announced new disclosure requirements in an attempt to increase transparency.
There are now 2 steps for people wishing to attend. 1, publicly disclose who is funding their participation at the conference, and 2, sign a pledge confirming that their objectives fully align with those of the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and the Kyoto Protocol.
The downside is, this is optional. The rules, unfortunately, also don't apply to those who are part of national delegations, and last year there were over 300 fossil fuel lobbyists who attended the talks as part of teams sent by a country. If we really want to progress and move away from our dependence on fossil fuels,
We simply can't let people with a huge vested interest in the status quo come to the table. Not when the future of the planet depends on it.
But what about those people who are representing countries? Have they set themselves up for success here? What have they said in the run-up to COP30? Well, to answer that question, I've enlisted the help of Aisha Tandon from the world's best climate reporting website, Carbon Brief. Together, we are going to grade the homework that students, countries, turned in ahead of COP30.
Let's start with the homework from Brazil.
Brazil is hosting COP this year, and so the country has a wide range of priorities. One of them, for example, is the Tropical Forest Forever facility, which is a pot of money designed to help developing countries protect their forests.
Brazil is certainly putting its best foot forward when it comes to hosting this COP, and it has some impressive deforestation data to point to, but it is still issuing new fossil fuel licenses, which is incompatible with a 1.5 degrees trajectory. I think a B minus is fair, like good, but room for improvement. Next, the UK.
The UK was one of the first countries to submit its nationally determined contribution, and one of just 5% of nations to meet the initial deadline of February 2025. The UK is a major donor of climate finance, which comes out of the pot of money that the country has set aside for international aid. But now the UK, along with several other major climate finance providing countries, has slashed its budget for international aid.
So the UK has an important role at these talks because it was the first country to industrialise using coal, and so far it has made good progress in reducing its carbon emissions and showing the rest of the world that it can be done. Having submitted an NDC and Keir Starmer being there shows the government thinks it will look good, but the UK has a less impressive track record on nature. Just recently it blocked the publication of a report on the effect of tropical deforestation on the UK, and so far it hasn't committed to a new period of climate finance, including nature protection. Obviously I'm a bit biased, but I do think this pips it just above Brazil, but not by much. B, a level B.
Next, our first group submission, the Alliance of Small Island Nations.
The Alliance of Small Island Nations, or AOSIS, are some of the most vulnerable countries in the world, and so at COP30 they will be pushing for more urgent action to cut emissions. In particular, the Alliance of Small Island States is pushing for more funding for adaptation.
Let's be honest, these are the only guys who are taking this problem as seriously as it needs to be taken, because for them it's existential. As such, AOSIS gets an A, which should be the passing grade for this class, but anyway.
What about China?
The Chinese government is officially planning to reach peak emissions by the year 2030, after which it plans for emissions to drop. However, analysis from Carbon Brief suggests that the country may be ahead of schedule, with its emissions having already peaked.
Let's be real. China is the world's largest emitter. But what are we grading here? We're grading what they're bringing to the COP negotiations. And China is the driving force to cheap renewable electricity. They're failing their emissions class with huge current impacts. But in this class, like grading their trajectory, it's all right. Maybe a B minus.
And that's the bell. Well, I'll just take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to everyone who supports me on patreon.com/SimonOxfizz, which you can find linked in the description. I couldn't make my videos without Patreon, so thank you all of my patrons. If you would like to join them and help me make more videos, and in exchange, also get early access to my content, exclusive videos every month, including a behind the scenes vlog, and a producer tier and higher, vote on topics for me to cover, then you know where to find the link. With a special thank you to Matthias Bedino, Captain Japan, and Ileana Peneva. Thank you so much for your support. Now let's get back to grading some homework, starting with a group submission from the European Union.
Many major donors of climate finance in the EU, such as Germany and France, have slashed their aid budgets, and this could make it difficult for them to scale up climate finance in the future.
And just after we finished filming this video, the EU announced a new carbon target, which meant I had to refilm this bit. So the EU has said they want a 90% reduction in carbon emissions relative to 1990 levels by 20. Except 5% of that reduction can come from international carbon credits, and there's scope for another 5% to also come from carbon credits in the future. So it's kind of an 80% reduction, really. And don't get me wrong, that's big. Like, that's really a huge reduction and kind of not quite what we need, but pretty good. This has been watered down because it's a group submission and some countries in the EU are not quite so on board with climate action for the time being. I can't help but feel that the EU is a bit like the star student who could have submitted the perfect piece of homework but left it to the last minute. It's going to be a B+. Could do better.
Up next is India.
India has not submitted a new climate plan since the year 2022. A key focus for India, as with many developing countries, is to scale up action on climate finance. Specifically, India wants the climate finance money to come from developed countries rather than from the private sector.
I've said it before and I'll say it again, India is going to be the climate kingmaker this century. They could double down on coal and dirty energy, or they could join China in massive rollout of renewables. And because of their size, it's going to have a global impact either way. And at the moment, they're kind of doing something in the middle, like doing a bit of both. They're understandably pushing for climate finance, but they aren't committed to clean energy development. So I'm going to give them a C.
Now, before we grade our final student, I'd just like to point out that very few students actually submitted their homework, their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, the pledges they make to reduce their carbon emissions, at all, and even fewer did so on time.
But well done to St. Lucia, Ecuador, Uruguay, Switzerland, Andorra, Zimbabwe, Singapore, the Marshall Islands, and New Zealand.
And one other student who we were a bit surprised to see turn up to class.
The United States did submit a nationally determined contribution in 2024 under President Biden, but it's very unlikely that the Trump presidency is going to follow through with this plan.
We know there are no high-level federal officials attending COP30, but more than 100 state and local leaders will be attending, showing that individual states are keen to keep pushing on climate change, even if the federal government isn't.
But just because the United States isn't formally at COP30 doesn't mean that it's not going to try and influence proceedings. What we saw recently at the carbon tax negotiations at the International Maritime Organization was that America threatened countries that supported the carbon tax with tariffs, and lo and behold, negotiations collapsed. We don't know that they're going to do the same thing here, but it's a possibility.
So thanks for submitting your homework, America. You get an F. But you are welcome back to this classroom when you start taking the subject seriously again.
Now, I had some questions about one student's work in particular, so I thought I'd give them a call and find out what was going on.
Simon, can you see me all right? How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
How's Brazil?
It's good. I mean, we're just on day one of COP, so that's really, really important. Very strong delegation here from the United Kingdom. I've got the Prince of Wales with me, and actually just been here talking to young people. I spoke to young people in the UK as well before I left, because obviously they have to live with our decisions for far longer than we do. So before I left the UK, I asked a group of young people what were the most important things for me to raise at COP, and then I've done the same here with some of the young people who are here in COP with us.
I understand we only have a couple of minutes, so thank you for your time. And I'd have two questions for you, if you're ready.
Yeah, of course.
The first question is, the UK has a historic role to play at any climate negotiations because we were the first country to industrialise using coal. We have a responsibility here. So what is the UK going to do at this COP to demonstrate climate leadership?
Well, the first and foremost is we're already showing that leadership. We've been one of the leaders for many years. I think that we need to continue to show that leadership. Some people back at home are saying the climate doesn't matter anymore, the climate change can wait. I don't agree with that. I've always thought this is a really big challenge for us. And so by being here as Prime Minister with the Prince of Wales with me, that's real leadership from the United Kingdom. It is about stepping up to the challenge. There's more than that though, because it's also the single biggest opportunity that we have in terms of clean jobs for the future, the energy revolution that's going on with renewables. And I've been really pleased when whilst I've been here, to announce jobs in Great Yarmouth and in Manchester and in Belfast, where they're going to be working on wind turbines in two of those locations and batteries in the third. So huge leadership needed. Really important to meet the challenge, and I genuinely think the challenge is better met by countries working together rather than as a group of individuals going it alone. So that's why we're here, that's what we're doing, and the reward, if you like, is that we mitigate what's going on. We had flooding in Sussex, as you may have seen. We've had wildfires in Scotland, so we know it's impacting the United Kingdom. So we mitigate that, but also lots of jobs for the future as we go to clean energy.
And we have had tremendous success in the UK with bringing down our greenhouse gas emissions. We are a world leader, as you say, but that is only half of the problem we face. We also face, as well as a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis. So my second question is, what is the UK doing at home and abroad to protect nature and maybe specifically forests like the one behind you right now?
Right, so this is really important. And taking you up on your question about forests, back at home, we're growing and creating 3 new forests. One of them's already begun, and we're now planting more trees than at any time in the last 20 years. That's hugely important because obviously this is a huge part, not just of nature, but also actually of the climate challenge. Here in Brazil, there's a massive initiative in relation to the Amazon, which is being lost and cut down at an unsustainable rate, to turn that around. And so we're supporting that as well. So whether it's back at home or whether it's here, we're doing a lot in relation to nature, biodiversity, and forests in particular. And I think, I feel strongly that I think the British really care about their forests. Remember that sycamore that was cut down illegally up in the northeast? The sort of pain across the nation that a beautiful tree was lost is something which I think is quite dear to all of us, quite passionate for all of us. And so I think knowing that these forests are being created across in the UK, I think will be something most people think that's a really good thing.
Well, I believe we're actually out of time, Prime Minister. So the eyes of everyone in 2100 are watching, hopefully including my daughters. So let's get this right, please.
Very good to see you again. Thanks.
Good to see you.
Bye now.
Well, okay. I'm just going to give my initial reaction to this camera here. Firstly, bit surreal. I should be clear that I only had a couple of minutes to ask some very high-level questions. I actually asked more technical questions initially, and they said, can we please ask these to a minister who is more specifically clued up into this area? Let's do with really high-level stuff. So that's why I asked the questions that I asked. I do think we can be proud as the UK in terms of our track record in bringing down emissions. A lot of what he said in regards to that first question hits home. The second question was I very specifically asked because the UK doesn't have such a track record when it comes to nature. I do think the Prime Minister was right that we have a special affinity for nature and maybe especially forests. He's referencing the Sycamore Gap tree, which I visited. Yeah, I stand by that. But firstly, afforestation in temperate areas like the UK has an important role to play, but it is not a substitute for preventing the loss of tropical forests. And what he alluded to was the Tropical Forest Forever facility, which was this new fund that's being created by Brazil. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. The facility is like the front-loaded bit that all the money goes into. We heard today, and I would have loved to have asked this as a follow-up, but it was made clear to me that I didn't have time, that the UK was not going to give taxpayer money to that fund, but we're going to facilitate it.
How do I put this delicately?
And that was a very politician's answer, because we are supporting this, which is true, but it's not supporting in perhaps the most meaningful way. And I think there was a bit of an apples and oranges comparison between temperate and tropical forests going on in that answer, which, again, if I had more than 4 minutes to do this interview, I would have liked to have learned more about. And I do have another interview coming up tomorrow, so maybe I can ask it there.
The UK has certainly put its best foot forward when it comes to COP. Like at his speech in Berlin, the Prime Minister said that we were doubling down, we were all in on fixing climate change, and great. Really, really great to see that. But when it comes to specific details, things don't look quite so great. It's why we didn't give them a perfect grade earlier. And actually, one of the particular sticking points is to do with nature, which is why I asked that question, but it's also to do with finance. Climate finance is the money put to one side to stop climate change from getting worse and to help people deal with the consequences of climate change.
And trying to fix it is one of the key objectives of COP30. Climate finance can be broken down into 2 strands of funding: mitigation and adaptation.
Mitigation is money put aside for prevention, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, investing in renewables or increasing carbon sinks like forests. Whereas adaptation is about anticipating the effects of climate change and minimizing the damage. So here you're looking at financing infrastructure like building seawalls or developing drought-resistant crops, and even creating cash safety nets that communities can rely on in the case of climate-intensified natural disasters. In both cases, funds are needed much more in developing countries as they're already experiencing the greatest effects of climate change and still have a long way to go in developing their energy systems. So do you want the bad news or the bad news? As part of the Paris Agreement, developed countries agreed to find a balance between mitigation and adaptation, but the amount of money raised for mitigation currently greatly outweighs the amount raised for adaptation. In fact, in 2023, the amount provided dropped by $2 billion from the previous year. The goal for 2025 was supposed to be $40 billion in adaptation funding, and It's not looking good. The second piece of bad news is that 65% of current funding is in the form of loans. And a recent report by Oxfam and CARE Climate Justice Centre found that developing countries are paying more back to wealthy nations for climate finance than they're actually receiving. In fact, for every $5 they get, they are paying back $7. This increases their debt and, of course, hinders further climate action. So at the moment, rich countries are paying poorer countries to stop making the problem worse, but A, not enough, and B, are not also helping those poorer countries adapt to the more dangerous environment that they find themselves in. Danger that was overwhelmingly added by those same rich countries.
So, at COP30, the goal is creating a roadmap to $1.3 trillion per year of funding for developing countries so they can mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change by 2035.
And there's one more specific form of climate finance that's going to be talked about a lot at COP30, so it's worth discussing it here in a little bit more detail. And it's all to do with deforestation. In the past decade, the world lost on average 11 million hectares of forest, overwhelmingly tropical forests, every single year.
That works out to 29 football pitches of forest lost every minute of every day.
And while large-scale planting is happening, this is mostly in temperate regions, and it cannot replace the loss of mature tropical forests. In particular, the Amazon is currently about 18% deforested, and because of a mix of deforestation and climate change, if that number goes above 20%, there's a reasonable chance the Amazon could flip into a self-sustaining dieback loop.
And because the Amazon is such a crucial carbon sink, if that happens, it will make efforts to keep global temperatures down even harder. Then add on the loss of biodiversity and the impact on 50 million people dependent on the rainforest.
So to try and address this, one of the headline discussions at COP30 is the TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. This is the single largest fund ever for the protection of nature, $125 billion. And quite importantly, it's being spearheaded by Brazil, which hosts 40% or so of the world's tropical rainforest. That 125 billion comes from a few sources. 25 billion comes from state funds, so taxpayer money, while 100 billion comes from philanthropy, foundations, and private investors. And the key word here is it is an investment. It's not a grant. These people will get their money back eventually, because the big pot of money that gets generated gets invested in various vehicles, stocks and shares, that kind of thing, with the idea being that the investors will get their money back at the end of a multi-decadal process, but the profits from the investment are then distributed to rainforested countries. Specifically, profits get allocated to rainforested countries if they keep their deforestation below a certain threshold, with 20% going to indigenous groups. To give you another stat that we'll come back to in just a little bit, the rainforested countries get payments if their deforestation rate is less than 0.5% of their total forested area, with the forested area being defined as anything with canopy cover over 20%. And while the UK isn't a rainforested country and it's not going to receive any money from the fund, it was quite instrumental in helping create it and advising on the structure of the TFFF. But just before COP30 started, the UK announced that it was not going to be committing any public money to the fund, having, helped design it. And I wanted to ask the Prime Minister why that was the case, but I was told that he wasn't really the right person to answer that question. So I was put in touch with somebody who could answer it.
And a specific project that we've heard a lot about at this COP is the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. We heard yesterday the UK isn't going to be putting taxpayer funds into it. When I spoke to the PM, he said his word was that we were going to be supporting the fund. Could you clarify what support means in this context? And was the decision to not dedicate taxpayer funds because of budgetary constraints, or was it because you were dissatisfied with how the facility fund was being structured?
It's a really important question. We've worked with the Brazilians for a couple of years on the TFFF, as it is known. We've helped design the TFFF. At the moment, what we're committing to is working with the World Bank, that is the administrator of the fund, working with the City of London to get private finance flowing. We haven't committed money at this stage, and given the budget that's coming up and the fiscal backdrop, you can understand some of the reasons for that. But it's certainly not to do with an unhappiness about the fund. We think the fund is a really great innovation. Indeed, it was nominated for Prince William's Earthshot Prize. And so it's something we're going to keep under review about whether we could make a public contribution in the future.
Is the government considering anything around direct cash transfers, or are you sort of still sticking with more traditional funding mechanisms?
Look, we look at a range of funding mechanisms, both bilateral help through international institutions. Again, you know, my take on this, and we had a lot of discussion about this last year's COP around the so-called NCQG, which is the new collective quantified goal, which was 300 billion set for 2035. My sense of this is one of the biggest complaints of developing countries was the money just not flowing. So money being allocated but not actually getting out of the door. And so the so-called quality of finance, as well as things like adaptation, are really, really important. And working, and this is one of the things that my team is engaged on, working on making sure that that money flows. Of course, it's got to be well spent, but that the money doesn't just get held up for year after year. That's another big priority for us.
The benefits of getting this right are impossible to overstate. So I wish you luck in the negotiations, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Simon. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Cheers, Ed.
Take care. Bye, bye, bye.
Right, so immediate reaction to that. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Of all the politicians that I've ever worked with, Ed Miliband gets it when it comes to this issue. He knows his stuff. He gave me lots of time then. He answered difficult questions. Obviously, there's a level of obfuscation that politicians are going to do, but I think that those answers, that's about the best that we can ask for when it comes to senior politicians attending these conferences. Like, I need to sit down and go through his exact responses and have a bit more to say probably, but that's certainly very, very encouraging. Now, if you'd like to watch all of my chat with Ed Miliband, which was about 15 minutes, then you can do so. It's uploaded to my second YouTube channel and linked down in the description. Now, I have mixed feelings about the UK not putting money into the TFFF. Because, like a lot of environmental groups, I have some issues with how it's been constructed. Firstly, the fact that this is an investment vehicle where investors are guaranteed their money back before any action actually happens on deforestation and any money gets paid to rainforest communities or anyone else who's working with rainforests. The fact that it's only 20% going towards indigenous communities is, I mean, that's good and all, but like, why isn't this higher? And why are investors getting the money back before any action happens with deforestation? I mean, the answer is because that's how you actually get the money in the first place. But it does open the possibility that if this fund doesn't do well or even loses money, for example, I don't know, let's imagine that there was some sort of speculative bubble that's happening right now, then this isn't going to do anything. And lastly, the definition of what constitutes deforestation, like a forested area somewhere with canopy cover of more than 20% of a given hectare, that's a very weak definition. It means that actually huge amounts of deforestation can happen, but under the terms of the TFFF, it doesn't count, and so money can still flow to rainforested countries even if they have irresponsible policies. We have the monitoring tools to do better than this. Brazil has fantastic monitoring tools, so this just feels like a really weak inclusion. As I say, it's probably a net positive force, but we know there are better ways to prevent deforestation. I mean, I'm biased because I'm an ambassador for Cool Earth, but they're a charity that gives unconditional cash transfers to rainforested communities. We know that that's a highly effective way of displacing mining and logging companies because it gives these communities who don't want to sacrifice their trees an alternative. In the next 2 weeks, we'll find out what the TFFF is actually going to be working with in terms of its investments, but also logistically. I've got mixed feelings about it. Now, I hope that this video has given you a solid primer on what COP is, why it matters, and what's being discussed in Belém over the next 2 weeks. And we will make a video at the end of the process, I'm not quite sure what form it's going to take yet, talking through the final text and everything that was kind of agreed at the conference. So if you're not already, please do subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that. If you'd like to watch 2 videos I prepared earlier, then here they are. And that just leaves me to say thank you for watching. I hope that you took something away from it. If you did, please do the YouTube pleasantries, like, comment, all that kind of thing. And I'll see you in the next one.